Hey guys, Chris here with theGoodOldGamer. So today we're finally going to be taking a look at how to get older games running on modern hardware. And today we're going to look at the easiest and most effective ways to do this. Now last week I posed the question, which parts of modernizing old games are you most interested in? And you guys voted. So we're going to take this in stride with basically what you're most interested in. Now what I found interesting is a lot of the comments were basically people saying that they were unaware of what the vast majority of these were, and that's the reason why they picked remastered editions, which won out at 49%, because everybody knows what remasters are. And a lot of this stuff, a lot of you guys actually don't know what they are, so that's what we're going to be talking about here today, because to run older games and run them at their absolute best, each and every one of these needs to be implemented to make that work. So the technical definition of remaster, also digital remastering, refers to the change of quality of sound or image or both of previously created recordings, either audiophonic, cinematic, or videographic. Okay, so we're talking about the video graphics here, and remastered editions are actually very similar to source ports, so we'll talk about that next. Essentially, this is where a game developer goes ahead and recreates the game and game engine, or imports an old game into a brand new game engine, so this way it's able to be run on modern operating systems. Now, the difference between a remaster and a remake is a remaster is true to the source game. In fact, they change as little as possible, besides putting in basic quality of life increases and updates to make your life better. For example, widescreen gaming, for example, will be added in. So right now I'm showing you Turok Dinosaur Hunter. This was remastered by Night Dive Studios. They're actually going through and remastering a lot of old games, and they do a very good job of this. The game itself is, for the most part, identical to the original game, except it runs just fine on modern hardware, and the game looks a little bit better. They push back the fog. Textures look a little bit more crisp, but that may just be texture filtering of some sort. That, as far as I can tell, they didn't really change any of the assets of the game. So this is a great example of a remaster. So right here, this is actually the original Turok. This footage is from G-Man Lives' review. Link will be in the description below if you want to see old first-person shooter reviews. G-Man Lives is really good at that. I don't have the original version on PC. I played it on the N64 back in the day. But you can see that the difference between the remaster and the original is very, very slim. They're basically the exact same game. Like I said, some few minor tweaks, but the biggest thing is the game runs very easily on modern hardware, whereas getting the original PC Windows 95 version of Turok running on a modern system is extremely annoying. And honestly, if there is a remaster available of any games that you love, that is going to be your best option to play those old games. Now, I mentioned source ports, and a lot of you guys actually don't know what a source port is. In fact, one of the questions here from Watch Me was source port, source engine ports. No, it actually has nothing to do with the source engine. So this is a misconception by a lot of people out there. In fact, a source port is a software project based on the source code of a game engine and allows the game to be played on operating systems or computing platforms which the game was not originally compatible. So that is the technical definition. And these are typically community-based projects. There's actually a nice list here on Wikipedia. I'll put a link to this in the description below. You can check these out. There's a lot more out there as well. Now, not all of these run perfectly. These are community-made, so there's ups and downs. Some work, some don't. For example, OpenJK is one that I was really interested in. However, it works well with Jedi Academy, but does not work well with Jedi Outcast, which is my favorite of those two games. So that's a pretty good example of kind of working. So it's still useful under certain circumstances, and these are going to be very trial and error. Now, the most notable source port out there, in my opinion, is ZDoom. And the reason for that is it works on all games powered by the same engine as Doom. So, for example, I'm going to show you some footage here of the ZDoom source port, and you're going to see it running in DOSBox, which is a more accurate representation of what Doom looked like back in the day. You can see a very, very clear difference here between these two games. The ZDoom source port modernizes a lot of stuff and makes Doom almost like a brand new game. So even though it's true to the original source material, it has the same audio files, it uses all the same assets. The game now supports widescreen, proper mouse support. You can look up and down, you can even jump. There's a lot of cool things added in. And one of the biggest features of ZDoom is it actually takes the MIDI file and uses something called Fluid Synth that actually alters the audio. It's still the original MIDI file, but it goes ahead and changes it to make it sound much more modernized. So here, take a listen. As you can hear, the ZDoom version sounds much, much better than the original General MIDI synthesizer that I was using on DOSBox. So it's very clear that older games can be brought up to modern standards pretty easily when source ports are available. Now, not all games can have source ports because the source code is not open to everybody to go ahead and tinker with. So in my eyes, outside of a straight remaster from a notable publisher, a source port is going to be your next best bet to getting older games running on modern operating systems. Ironically enough, a lot of these source ports actually have 64-bit executables, so they actually run natively on x64 systems, which is great. As a quick aside, I just want to touch on emulation here real quick. That wasn't one of the options that I had for you, but there are two emulators that you need to be aware of if you're going to be running older PC games. First one is obviously DOSBox, that I kind of touched on when I showed you Doom. Any 16-bit DOS-based game should run just fine in DOSBox. One thing you will need to become familiar with is the configuration file. Now, this is something that will take some getting used to, but once you get familiarized with this particular file, you can go ahead and alter the games to run to your liking. You can go ahead and enable things like VSync. You can use different renderers, for example. OpenGL is supported. However, FreeSync nor G-Sync support OpenGL, so I would probably stay away from that unless you enable VSync, of course. A lot of these older games will have weird frame rate limits. For example, Doom has a frame rate cap of 35 FPS. So without VSync, that could be a problem. You can adjust the audio. You can adjust the cycle speed of the CPU or the emulated CPU. This is very important if you're using a game that isn't done by like GOG or something. If you're just installing an old DOS game, you will need to tinker with that. For example, it took me forever to get Warcraft 2 working. Luckily, GOG now has Warcraft 2 on there, so I don't have to worry about it. But that will take some tinkering to figure out the right spot. You can up the audio bitrate if you want to, change the way that it does that. You can change the controls of joysticks and all kinds of stuff. Pretty much all PC-based games pre-96 will run in DOSBox. So you will need to familiarize yourself with that, but it's not that difficult and they have everything kind of spelled out for you. And the second most important emulator to understand is ScummVM. If you're a fan of the old graphic adventure games from LucasArts, for example, that's essentially what this VM was designed to do, what this emulator was originally intended to do. Now, this emulator does support a lot of other games other than just Scum Engine games. They have an entire list on their website. You can check it out. And honestly, if ScummVM does support the game that you want to play, this is the superior option to DOSBox. Main reason why is audio emulation is much better on ScummVM, and in those old graphic adventure games, audio is a big deal. So I would certainly recommend using this over DOSBox if it is available for the game that you want to play. All right, so moving on, the next most upvoted category would be community patches and fixes. Okay, so this is going to solve the vast majority of your problems if there's not a remastered edition nor a source port out there available. And let's say it's a newer game, so a Windows-based game, not something that DOSBox nor ScummVM can run. You're going to need to patch this thing. So the best place to start for this is the PC Gaming Wiki. I mean, plain and simple, this is the place to go. So for example, let's pick Unreal. This is a game that came out in 1998. And yeah, still really, really fun to play here today. So they break things down very easily. First off, they'll tell you where you can buy the game if you want to actually buy it, which is great. Moving on down, they will have their essential improvements and kind of tell you what it does for you. All you have to do is click the link. The links, I haven't seen any bad links or links that would send you to a nefarious website. Everything here works well. So all you got to do is just click download and you're good to go. Now, for graphics, this is where things really get interesting. So a lot of these older games using pre-DirectX 9, modern computers and hardware do not like DX8 on back. So looking for something that will update the API is big. So for example, the Direct3D 10 renderer, or DirectX 10 renderer, this is pretty much essential here to getting this game running very, very well on modern hardware. You can keep going through the list here and they'll tell you exactly what sort of options are available for you. For example, if there's controller support. So at the end of the day, if you have any questions about the game, will it run? How can it run? What can I get to do to make it work? Typically, this is going to have the answers, but not every single time. If you're still having trouble, the next best place to check out is actually the Steam forums. Now, you are going to be limited to games that are available on Steam, but let's be honest, the vast majority of titles out there are in here. Now, typically, I'll just do a Google search and Steam forums will pop up as one of the answers. Now, the reason why I recommend the Steam forums are I've solved a lot of problems and once again have not run into the issue where I've gotten any nefarious websites. You'll also find links to like Google Docs where people will upload fixes that they've created themselves that honestly you're just not going to find anywhere else. So between PC Gaming Wiki and the Steam forums, you should be able to find a solution in there. If you can't find a solution there, you're really, really going to be in some trouble. Next up, we have DG Voodoo nglide DXVK in Linux. Okay, so a lot of you guys probably have no idea what any of that is, and if you have any intention of playing any old games, you're going to need to become very familiar with all of these, except for maybe DXVK if you're not gaming in Linux. Now, nglide is a piece of software that you can install on your PC. You can do it per game basis, or you can just install it overall. For example, I have it on my system here. And what this will do is on the fly, anytime it sees that you're running a game that uses the 3DFX Glide API, it will automatically kick in and switch the API to a modern DirectX API. So essentially, it's translating the old Glide API into modern DirectX. This is really great. You can also go ahead and force certain resolutions if you want to into games that, well, let's say they don't support widescreen. Well, you can make them support widescreen. You can support different refresh rates, and it gives you more control over older games that may just not have these options because they weren't a big deal back then. This is probably the easiest solution to get old Glide games running on modern hardware. Now, the 1997 through 2000 era where 3DFX dominated, Glide was huge, and they have a big list on here of all the games that they support. You can check them out for yourself. Getting like the original Turok running, this would be necessary, or DG Voodoo, which I'll cover here in a minute. But this is probably the simplest and easiest way to get this up and running. And if you don't want to download patches and stuff for a game like Unreal, you can use nglide instead to then update into a more modern API. Now, DG Voodoo, apparently they had their site hacked because every time I go to it now, it keeps saying that there's viruses there. So I do recommend picking this up from the PC Gaming Wiki. They have the download here. It's from their own servers, and this one's clean. So once again, that's one of the reasons why I like this site. Now, what this is another wrapper very similar to what nglide is. It'll change the old APIs into more modern APIs, so your graphics card will be like, hey, I know what to do with this. The main difference is DG Voodoo also supports updating of old Direct3D. So things like DirectX 8, 7, 6, really old DirectX games, you can use this to update to DirectX 11, which is really, really handy and actually necessary for certain games. To get DG Voodoo up and running, all you have to do is pick either Microsoft, which means DirectX, or you can do 3DFX with this. So it's up to you whichever way you want to go. But like I said, just use nglide for most of the Glide stuff. So all you have to do is just take the DLL files and drop them into the game's main system file. Usually it's called bin or system, or it just might be the root file, basically where its other DLL files are. And then you take the DG Voodoo setup file and drop that in there as well. So all you gotta do is just drop a few files, run the configurator, and this is very similar to the Nglide, where you can go ahead and force different options. You can force resolutions if you want to, and this gives you more freedom. Now, it will pop up with a DG Voodoo watermark when you run the game. This is to let you know that it's actually working. So once that's done, you can then disable the watermark, and poof, you're good to go. Now, this is very much necessary to getting older games running where everything else has failed. Basically, we're covering this in order of how you should approach this situation. I have run into situations where DG Voodoo will actually cause more issues than actually solve. For example, GTA 3 is a notoriously difficult game to get running, and I decided to try using DG Voodoo, and it was actually hindering my progress, as I found out just removing this solved my problem. So I would use this as your last resort. Now comes the fun one, DXVK in Linux. Okay, so there's a few different ways you can do this, but the simplest and easiest way to take advantage of Linux gaming is going to be through Steam. I've recently tested out their newer versions of Proton, which is basically DXVK and Wine all combined together and just tweaked by Valve. So you don't have to mess with any settings. They're basically doing all the hard work for you. So all you have to do is just switch your Steam account on Linux. I was just using Ubuntu. Switch it to the beta mode so you get access to all of the updates and every option that's available. But honestly, all of the Proton versions 4.0 or higher have worked fine for me, and I've had no issues. And amazingly enough, what I really wanted to do was spot check a few different trouble games here. I tried the Resident Evil 2 remake, that worked just fine, so I was very happy with the way that this worked on newer games. So no problems running games in Linux, and I was only using a RX 460 on a Xeon 3470, which is basically an i7 870. So this was very basic hardware, and it ran just fine. So obviously the next thing I wanted to check out were, like I said, more problem games that typically don't run well on Windows, modern Windows anyway. So I kicked things off with Deus Ex Invisible War. While definitely the worst of the Deus Ex games, this can run on Windows 10, but it has a lot of issues in the menu, like changing resolutions and things like that. This had no issues at all running via Proton on Linux. So this worked great. It just worked. I mean, it's essentially what RTX was supposed to be. It just worked. And I was very, very impressed with that. As I mentioned before, GTA 3 is extremely difficult to get running on a modern Windows 10 system, but inside of Linux, using Proton, which, like I said, is DXVK and Wine wrapped into one, once again, it just worked. The only kind of quirk here is you had to Alt-Tab into the game. Whatever. That's a lot easier than having to find 15 different patches and rotating them in and out until you find the one that works. I did eventually get it to work on Windows, but oh god, is that annoying. And perhaps I'll do a video on that, because what worked for me may or may not work for you. But if you want to avoid that situation entirely, just run the game in Linux. It just works. And since we've been talking about Max Payne, of course I did try that out on this system. And once again, that worked just as well. Didn't even have to fix up any of the audio. It just happened to work straight out of the box. So now, of course, I wasn't running this on my Ryzen 3000, as that still doesn't work even with Proton because it's a CPU issue. But on every other processor architecture, it'll work just fine. So finally, just as an extra test over here on Linux, I wanted to see something that used a different launcher. So I went ahead and put on Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, because that's going to need Uplay. And to my surprise, Steam with Proton will also emulate Uplay and get that up and running. So every single game that I tested on here, newer, older, they all just worked. Of course, with Linux, you also have access to all of those source ports games. So that's making Steam and Linux almost the de facto way to go for retro gaming. And honestly, it's getting to the point where Linux might be the way to go for gaming, period, since modern games run just fine on there as well at this point. So that's a whole nother discussion, but if you're having serious trouble getting your games to run on Windows, you might want to try Linux using Steam and their Proton DXVK stuff. Now, you can manually configure all that stuff yourself. That is a much bigger deal, and it takes a little bit more time. There are a lot of good guides out there on the internet that could show you that. I didn't go into it, as most of the games I wanted to test I already had on Steam, and that just simply makes life a lot easier because, once again, it just worked. Now, the last thing on the list was EAX via Creative Alchemy. There's a few of you guys out there that went ahead and pumped out there that Asus's Sonar sound cards, those would actually emulate EAX as well. Come to find out, that will only do EAX version 2 and 5, and that's done via the C Media chip. In reality, if you want the best and most comprehensive way to get EAX back into games on your modern hardware, the best way to do that is to just pick up a creative card from the Xi Titanium, pretty much to current, and using their Alchemy software, because that will work on every single game that supported EAX. For those of you who are unaware of what EAX is, basically this is where the sound hardware would take a lower quality sample sound and then go ahead and add effects to it. This would also take load off of the CPU, as the CPU would need to decompress the audio. Instead, you had dedicated hardware to do that. CPUs today are so powerful that's not really necessary to enhance performance, but the extra effects added in do make a big difference. So let's take a look here at Fear running with EAX on and EAX off. You can clearly hear the difference. It much more reverb, it sounds more realistic. With EAX off, the game sounds very, very flat in comparison versus a much fuller and richer sound. Now, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to translate over, YouTube with all the compression and stuff, but you should be able to hear the difference fairly well. And that's the effect in pretty much all games. Now, a lot of people might not like that sort of effect, especially if you're used to the way a game sounds. If you're used to it being very flat and your brain going, hey, this isn't how this is supposed to sound. Well, it is. The game developers made the game with EAX in mind. So that was the optimal way to play the game. So playing it with EAX is the proper way of listening to the game, and the way that you might be used to it is actually not the proper way that the developers wanted you to hear it. Now, most channels don't talk much about sound cards anymore, but modern day sound cards, they're still out there. From Creative, you can go ahead and pick them up. The Sound Blaster Z comes in at $94. It's not too bad. You have the latest and most upgraded model, which is the Sound Blaster X 8E5. This one's got the RGB. If you remember, every reviewer went through this not too long ago. This will work with EAX. And then this is what I have. I have the USB Sound Blaster X G5. And once again, this works just fine as well. But you don't need any of these newer, more modern sound cards if you don't want to. You could save a few bucks and go ahead and pick up the old Creative Sound Blaster Xi Titanium, for example. I have one of these as well. These are starting to go up in price. When I got mine, I got it in the box, kind of like this, but I think I got it for like $29 or something. So prices on these are starting to go up. So I wouldn't wait too long if you want to pick one of these up. These are all PCIe one time, so they will work on all modern motherboards. You can even get older PCI sound cards from Sound Blaster up and running. I don't know if Alchemy would be supported on those, so I would pretty much stick from this level or from this sound card all the way to newer because it has official Windows 10 drivers from Creative Labs, and it does technically support Alchemy. Well, alrighty guys, so that's a lot of stuff that we covered there. And like I said, if you kind of follow the list that we went through in order on how to get old games running, you should be all right. The only game that I couldn't get up and running was Max Payne, and like I said, that was due to a hardware issue on newer CPUs. Will that be fixed? Will it be patched out? Maybe. It's one of those things that should and probably will happen, but you can't be guaranteed that it will. That's why I wanted to make that video, because it is a problem. As hardware progresses, things will continue to break. They will be fixed by the community. But what's really nice is nowadays the API is no longer a limitation. With things like DG Voodoo and Nglide, you can go ahead and update all of those old APIs to more modern APIs, so modern graphics cards don't have an issue with these older games. In conjunction with Creative's Alchemy wrapper, you can go ahead and re-input all of the EAX capabilities back into those old 1990s and 2000s games. And honestly, when you have all of that going, there's really nothing that cannot run on modern hardware. Like I said, the only issue that I ran into was the Max Payne game. Now, you can find ways around pretty much every problem, and if there isn't a fix right now, there will likely be a fix in the future. Big question is, when will that be? Could be 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years, you have no idea. So I don't count on things coming into fruition until they're already here, but the vast majority of issues are already solved. One of the greatest things is DXVK via Proton in Linux. Steam has made it so easy to use Linux and pretty much run all Windows games on Linux, no problem. And that resolves most of the issues that you have. You don't need unofficial patches, you don't need to update the APIs, because Steam will change the API automatically. It has to run in Linux. And that is one of the simplest ways to get all of this up and running. So, alrighty guys, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. Did you find this helpful? If there's any games in particular that you'd like me to take a look at, we can definitely do that. Let's make sure that's not some super obscure game, because if it's something like Chex Quest or something, for example, that maybe 5 people have heard of, that's not really that beneficial. But if there are larger titles out there, for example, GTA 3, that was a real pain in the ass to get up and running on Windows 10. I will do a video on that one because of how much time it took. It took me about a month to get that up and running. But it just worked in Linux, of course, so, you know, that's the easiest solution. But other than that game, if you guys have any other games that are particularly difficult to get up and running, AVP 2 is another one. I had it up and running. It's not working now. It's one of those, it's kind of back and forth. It's a very difficult game to get running. Even back in the day, it was hard to get running. So those are the two probably toughest games that I can think of to get running, is GTA 3 and Alien vs. Predator 2. But let me know down in the comment section below any other games that you're having trouble with, and if you found this helpful. If you like this video, please hit that like button, please subscribe, please share with friends, that really does help me out. And if you want to help support the Retro Revolution, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. Then we can talk about this stuff on the Discord server. But that's all I have for today, and I will catch you guys in the next video.